There we are. So, welcome everybody.
Hello.
Oh, I can hear myself. That's a problem. There we go. All right. So, today we're going to just do a quick lecture and Q&A on the interface, core concepts, tips and tricks, and Q&A of Unity 2022. So, to start things off, I'm just going to go ahead and jump right into it. This is recorded, so you can watch this later, and I'll be later putting up on YouTube with markers for the different sections so you can easily jump through. But I'm just going to go ahead and power through most of these sections. I'm going to cover what I can, and I'll answer things as we go, and as well as answering stuff afterwards. Okay, I also have the beautiful and illustrious Mixie Blacksand here as my co-host.
Hey.
And they'll be helping with things as well. So, let's get started. First things first, we're looking at Unity 2022 version .3.22F1. This is specifically for the current version of VR chat. A lot of the stuff that we'll be doing will be relevant for that.
Still seeing the intro screen. Are we supposed to be seeing Unity yet?
Oh, yes. Here. Do this. And voila. There we go.
There we go.
So we're looking at 2022.3.22F1. This is the most recent version for the most recent version of VRChat SDK, which is what we'll be using for some of the other stuff later. I'll be later covering things like in-depth on avatars, things like VRC Fury, world stuff, bakery lighting, but for today, this is going to be just the core Unity stuff, where things are, the names of things, some core concepts that you should really be familiar with. So we're going to start here with the default layout. This is the standard layout that you get when you first open Unity. And all of these windows here are useful in their own regard, but there's a few that I would like to add that help along with that. So before I get started, I'm going to add a few windows. I'm going to go into the animation tab. I'm going to add an animation tab. That goes here. And I'm also going to add the Animator, which in the future I'll be referencing this as the controller editor, since that helps to delineate between these two, since they're very similarly named, which doesn't help much. But for now, I like to drop those there and here. On the Unity default layout, it's useful to have pretty much everything available in one space so that you can kind of jump around. You can move your windows around, though. So starting with the left here, we have what is called the hierarchy. This is going to show all the objects in your scene, as well as their configuration and their parenting to each other. You can see how things are set up here. So the hierarchy is very useful in terms of knowing where your stuff is and organizing things as well. So you can make parent objects, you can drop things underneath, you can keep your scene very minimal here if you need to. For now, I've just got some avatars loaded in so that I have something to work with. The right side is going to be your inspector. This is your second most important window in all of Unity. This shows you all the properties of whatever object you have selected. So this is going to be your transform, where your location, rotation, and scale values are. Almost every object in the system will have this transform component. You also have things like the camera or the listeners, or when you come to an avatar, you've got other important components here. All of your settings are here. All of these settings get stored directly onto the object, and they're not written to a file. So that's something to keep in mind for later, is that objects in the scene store their data in the scene, for the most part. You can move and drag these windows around, so that's very useful, and I'll cover that in a moment. But we're going to move on to the project window here, so that's down here. This lets you browse through all of your files within your project. You have two main folders, the assets and packages. Assets is where all your stuff is going to go. So this is where your files will actually sit. And these are on disk in your hard drive. So these are actual files. They're not just references to things. These are the real files sitting on your disk. You have the console here, which is incredibly useful for discovering if you've got errors or scripting problems that are causing the rest of your scene to stop working, or your avatar to not build, or your world to just not function. You have your animation tab here, which is useful for editing animations. You've got the keyframes will show up here. You have a timeline bar up here that you can use to move the timeline, and the frames for animations will actually be in the center here. You have your game view, which is useful sometimes for seeing what your camera can see, which you can select which camera is being displayed by using this display drop down and targeting a certain display from the camera here. This is useful for playing with fizz bones and messing around with contact colliders if you're in play mode. The Animator tab here, also the controller editor, is where you would do the bulk of the work for logic for your avatar, as well as for some stuff for worlds. Here you would have different layers that each run different sets of logic over here. You have your list of parameters that can interact with, but the Animator window itself is just very useful for the brain of your avatar. So I think that covers the generic locations of things and where they are. You can also use the layouts window up here, so this little drop down is incredibly useful for different kinds of layouts, and I have some of my own, as well as the default ones. So you'll probably never use this 4-split, but you can see how it divvies out the scene into different things. There's 4 different scenes from different angles. You have your camera movement here. There's one that I like to use, which is this one. This is my default. I like a nice, big, large scene view. I like a nice inspectors. I have 1 or 2 of them here, as well as the hierarchy right next to it. Makes it really easy to drag and drop stuff when you're moving stuff around. And on the other screen, which you can't see, I have these windows. So I have 2 project browsers, which makes it very easy to browse around and grab stuff. I can lock one so that I can be in a specific folder and just always show those materials or objects in there. You have my animator over here. I have settings for lighting. So this is for world stuff. You're going to want this lighting tab so that you can adjust the skybox as well as fog and other things for the light mapping, which we'll cover in another day, as well as the SDK tab so that I can upload stuff. It's all useful, but I don't always need it, so I like to have it off on my second monitor on the side here, and I can always just revert to where that is. For our things today, I'm going to be using the standard default layout, since it's just everything is in one space and I only have one screen to stream with. So that covers the basic windows and layouts. Is there anything so far anybody would like to talk about, or should I just move on?
So far, no comments.
Okay.
We covered the most important thing I always do, which is move the frickin' hierarchy next to the inspector, because you'll be working with those together constantly.
Yes.
Also, again, you touched on it a few times, but yes, you can have multiples of Dockers by simply going up into the bar and choosing to open another one. And having multiple inspectors or browsers is highly useful.
So you can add and remove windows very easily. So at any one of these where you see these little triple dots, you can click here and you can click Add Tab, and you can just add one of these. You can also add any window you want from up here. So one of the ones that is a custom one is the SDK from VRChat. So if I show a control panel, you get the SDK panel, and it doesn't show up as a tab that you can add, but you can click on the name part of the tab, and you can drag it around, and it will snap to anywhere that you drag. So I can drop this in here, and I've got it up here. And it's the way that this snaps is that each of these tabbed areas is considered its own sub area. So when you move a tab, it will try to snap to the top, bottom, and sides of that sub area. But if you bring it outside of it, you can see that this is considered its own sub area, and it's trying to snap to the sides of that. But if I go further and further, it will snap to the other outside window, the main window of the editor. And you can see I've got a new tab on the right here. So you can do this to do all sorts of nonsense. So I can grab, let's add another window, another inspector. I can take this and I can section it down to the bottom here, and I can have 2 inspectors now. So I can have one for, like, say I need this object just to reference its settings, and then I can click another one. So because I've locked this tab, this won't change. It always references that first object that I had selected, and I can go look at other stuff and change their settings and maybe copy it from here if I want to. And you can move these anywhere you want and do anything with these. So it's going to be up to your own, flow, how you feel things work best for you to move things where they feel good. And again, my layout looks like this, so I've got everything right next to each other. So switch back to default. There we go. For now, we're just going to keep these like they are. The snapping area, I know some people get confused about how that works, so just remember that anytime you see tabs like this, that's considered its own little sub area. So if you try to move something around in there, it's going to try to snap to the sides until you make a new sub area by dragging all the way like this. So you see it shifts everything down, and now I've got a new sub area up here. And you can combine them by just dragging onto the tab area. So very useful stuff. That's it's kind of one of those things that has come over from old Windows stuff, moving tabs around and stuff like that. I think it was introduced in like 7 or something like that. Anyway.
Okay, we're prepared to move on.
Yes. So next up, I want to talk about stuff from in the scene and in the hierarchy. So in Unity, everything is stored into a scene file. So in this case, this file is here. And this is an actual file that just stores all of the descriptions of all of these objects and their hierarchy and relation to each other. So this file here is the scene. This is all the stuff in the scene. Now, whenever you make a change, it does notice you've had a change, so it puts a little asterisk at the end. And until you click save, it's not written to this file. It's all stored in memory. So if Unity were to crash right now, any changes I've made would not have been saved to this file, and they'll all be reverted. You can also do that manually. If you right-click on the scene name, you can go to discard changes, and it will undo any changes you've made. So settings, moving stuff around, anything that affects these settings would be undone.
Yes. Specifically, it will revert anything done to the scene, but not things done to your assets.
Correct. Yeah, so if you change this model file example, like if you change the file, it can't fix that. You have modified the file itself. If you change the scene, that can be fixed. In terms of stuff to remove, so I see a lot of people removing the main camera and the directional light from their starter scenes. This is not necessary. In fact, I don't really recommend doing it because a lot of shaders will use the directional light, and VRChat references the main camera as like a template camera. So the main camera here is mostly used for worlds. So the main camera is how you attach things like post-processing to what the viewer sees when they're in your world. For avatars, the camera is mostly discarded. But for worlds, this is all these settings are mostly overridden, and it just looks for the audio listener and the post-processing volumes that are attached to it. For avatars, though, the directional light is incredibly useful for shaders. So shaders like Mochi and Poyomi and some specialty shaders need what is called a depth mask. This is produced by shadows from a directional light in the scene. So if this scene did not have this, or if I turn this to no shadows, any shaders that rely on a depth mask won't function because they don't get a depth mask. So you need at least this turned on. Now, this light is not uploaded with your avatar if you upload one. It is uploaded in a world if you have one, which is why some worlds sometimes don't have good lighting, because people will delete this light not knowing what it's for. So for avatars, it's not so much important that you upload it, but it is useful for testing your own shaders to make sure that they work. Let's see. Next one was... yeah. You can have multiple scenes, by the way. So if I take this actual scene file and I duplicate this, so I just pressed Control D to duplicate that, I can click and drag this whole scene, and I have a whole copy over here. Now, what's useful about this is that you can kind of use this for a little bit of versioning, so that you can have multiple versions of different avatars built. You can use this to optimize a certain avatar and then keep it in its own scene. You can also store like all of your generic testing stuff into a separate scene and then not have it in your main one, cluttering stuff up. So if you have things like Audio Link or Lightbox Viewer or some other tools that add stuff to the scene, you can make just a separate scene that's got all those things in it and just have it up at the top, and then you can minimize it. And now you don't have to worry about it taking up all this extra space, but it still functions for you. Can also use it to, like I said earlier, have versions of your stuff. Now, keep in mind that this is only the objects within and not the files. If you want to have versions of your files, you have to make multiple versions of your files. But if you want to make different scenes and stuff like that, you can totally do that here. I'm going to unload this. And yes, you can unload a scene and it will stay listed here until you want to load it again. But those files are no longer visible, they're no longer here taking up resources, and I can actually press delete on that and it won't do anything. So it just knows that, hey, you had a reference here, you can load it in if you want. Let's see. I think that was it for the hierarchy stuff. So we'll cover more on parenting and things like that a little bit later. But for now, I do want to focus on a few tags. So there are some.
Well, hang on. Before we get off the topic of scenes.
Oh, yes.
Volt had a question. When you go into play mode, does it auto-save the scene?
No, it does not autosave your scene. If you go into play mode, it takes what is here and it will just run with that, but it will not write it to file. So if you make changes and then go into play mode, those are all stored in memory. They're always stored in memory until you save. Unity will not automatically write files for you.
All right.
Okay.
Multiple people are typing.
Yes, I see. So for the VRChat SDK, when you're uploading and building, you must save the file. So the SDK will prompt you to save, and then you must click OK, since it needs to have the actual file saved and written before it can do an upload. Because the Unity SDK, or not the Unity, the VRChat SDK basically uploads a copy of your scene, so it has to be written to file for it to do that. It can't just take it from memory. And yes, Jesse brings up a point that yes, there is an autosave plugin, so you can have Unity automatically save from time to time, like some other programs do. That is your mileage may vary kind of thing, because there are many times when I don't want the scene to be saved, especially not unless I've done it myself, because there are plenty of times when I'm in here just messing around, experimenting with something that I know I'm not going to keep. And then when I'm done, I can right-click here and go discard changes, and all of those are wiped out. If I had an autosave plugin, then that would make that step difficult. But that is very much something you can have when you want.
Yeah, a workflow issue, depending on how you work, whether or not that is going to be useful for you or not.
I see a good question here from Skylar.
Yeah.
You want to read it out?
You want to read that?
Go ahead.
Okay. New question. I'm not sure if it's right. If I had an asset for a map and I copied it from another scene into another, would it still transfer over normally, like a copy paste that Windows uses?
Yes. So the way that these work is these are all references to an object, and these objects are all stored within the scene. So Unity knows that if you pull an object from one, so if I drag this directional light into this other scene, it will move it into this file, and you'll see that it's marked it as unsaved because I've made changes to this one and I made changes to this one. Unity knows that I removed an object from this and I added an object from this with these exact settings. So when you transfer objects or even whole hierarchies from one scene to another, Unity does the copy steps for you. And then when you save, then it gets written to file. That's when it is actually in the scene permanently, like it's written there now.
Which does bring up another thing I will continue to harp on: the difference between scenes and files on disk. If you have an asset that is used in multiple scenes and you modify it on disk, you are modifying it in every scene it exists in, which may potentially break things you don't intend to.
Correct. So if you have a model, say for instance this avatar model, if I replace the FBX of this model, every scene that references it will have that model updated. So keep that in mind, that if you edit the file, any scene that references gets updated. If you edit the object in a scene, that's stored only in the scene and in memory until you click save. Then it's written to a file. So that's an important distinction, which I'll cover a little more in depth a little bit later, since that requires a little bit more. But the gist of it is, if it's an object, it's usually stored in the scene. If it's a file, it's a reference, and it'll be stored everywhere. Okay. If anyone has any other questions, I'm going to move on to the next topic. So, this is a brief one. So layers and tags. We're not really going to cover layers and tags too much because they're specific to certain types of projects. So layers you use when you're building a world. Tags are useful in some scenarios, so not every. Specifically, the main camera. If you want it to be referenced by VRChat to use for like post processing or as a reference camera, it must be tagged as such as the main camera. VRChat looks for that specifically. It's just a minor thing. So you can have other cameras in your scene. So say if I move this camera and I put it here for like a thumbnail, right? I just hit Control-Shift-F to move the camera to my view. I can switch over to my game view, and if I remove this tag, set it untagged, and set it to display number 2, and preview display number 2. Oh, that camera does not like being that close. Let's do that. There we go. That's better. So now I have this nice preview of this other camera, and VRChat will just totally ignore it. It doesn't matter, because it's not tagged as anything important, and VRChat doesn't care about anything that's not directly on the avatar itself or part of the world. So you can use this for like preview cameras for thumbnails and all sorts of other fun stuff, and VRChat will just straight up ignore it. The other thing is the editor only tag. So this is useful if you have objects in your scene that should not be uploaded whatsoever. They should be completely stripped out when the build process is completed. And you can actually do, I don't know why these aren't, but this is a common thing. These won't be uploaded because they're not inside the avatar's armature. But if this were a world, these would be uploaded regardless of where they are. So what you can do is click this drop down and go to editor only. And now what that tells the system is that when it compiles this file for upload, anything marked editor only is just straight up deleted from the scene. So it's not included. Any references it makes, any materials it has, any textures that are on it, they're all excluded. So it's a really useful way to, for worlds specifically, to mark out like invisible colliders or triggers that you want to be able to see but not have them visible in the game. You can just make an object that is your marker object, and you mark it as editor only, and you can do whatever you want with it. And when you go to upload your world, it will just be stripped out of the world for you. So those two things are extremely useful. For the most part, you won't be using tags at all. That's really their big uses for VRChat use. You can use them if you're writing your own game. You can use them to mark certain types of objects, and you can find them with scripts. But that's not necessary here. In terms of layers, VRChat will autofill all these layers for you when you load the SDK. This is so that you can reference them for VRChat stuff. For the most part, you won't need them for avatars. For worlds, though, you can set up special layers that only collide with certain other things. You can put UI elements in that only interact with the UI when that's up. Some PvP worlds have custom layers set up so that you can do damage to other players if you send a particle on that layer. So the layering system is just here on this little drop down, and it's just kind of out of the way and tucked there. It doesn't really get its own window, and it's not really ever called out by anybody, but these are important. If you don't have them or they're not set up correctly, your avatar may not function well, or your world will just be a mess when you try to get into it. But generally, the SDK will take care of that for you, and you can actually edit them here by clicking these little drop downs. As far as I know, the names don't actually matter. I'm not certain on that, though, so don't quote me on that. But I don't think the names actually matter, just that they are named and have something there.
I'm pretty sure it's by index, but I'm also not 100% sure.
Yes, I want to say the same, but we'll, for all I know, VRChat references them by name, so just leave them alone. Okay, so moving on from that, we have here the 3D view. So this whole center section here is the 3D area. You can do lots of stuff from in here. All these buttons up at the top here change how everything's interact. And so I'm going to just start from the left here. So we have our pivot point, which is center or pivot, as well as local and global. So what this means is that if you have an object, there's an invisible umbrella here. I'm just going to hide that. If you have an object selected, let me grab the umbrella. Why not? So this umbrella, if I switch this to pivot to center, you'll see that the little transform gizmo moves to what is essentially the middle of the object. Now, this doesn't necessarily reflect like the origin point of a model if you have that. So if you set this up in Blender so that the origin point is right here at the tip, and you use center, you can see that when I move this or rotate it, it's going to move around the center and not the origin point. If I put this back to pivot, you can see that the origin point for this model is actually up here at the front, which I know it's not visible. That's just the material that's on it. But that's an important distinction to make when people are moving things. Like if I go to select the bone, actually this is a good place to do this. Let's go up spine, chest, let's grab one of the arms. So this arm here. So the difference between pivot is that if I use pivot, it will move where the bone should be, right? Oh, I have a second scene open. Hang on. Let me get rid of that. Don't save. There we go. So if I move this with pivot, you can see how that worked. If I move this to center, it may move the bone to a different spot and it may not work correctly. Oh, that's a bad example. Oh, maybe they fixed it for bones. Because what it used to do is it would put the pivot in the middle of the bone, and that's definitely not where you want it.
Yeah, it may depend on how the armature is set up, whether it will allow you to snap a joint like that.
Yes, that is very true.
Yeah.
But either way, this is important if you're keeping track of how a thing is centered or moved. So I always leave it on pivot, because that's usually the most accurate. And then next up is local. So if I have this object selected, you'll see that it has rotation values over here. But there is a difference between where this is in the hierarchy versus where it would be in the world. So if I switch to global, you'll see that the circles changed colors because now in global space, it always is what the scene has. So you're going to have your Z pointing forward, your Y pointing up, and your X pointing left and right. But if I go to local, it takes the local rotation of the object, which could be in a different orientation. As you can see, Z is pointing the other way. X is up and down and not left and right. So it's a whole different orientation. So this can change depending on what objects you have. If I take this object out of here, out of the hierarchy, and move it up here, out of it, yes, I am going to unpack. I'll unpack that real quick. That's fine. I'll fix it later. I'm going to grab that twist bone and just drop it out here. So anything down the armature side, it's going to take all the stuff from the parent objects. So right now the scale is all 1 all the way down into here. So the scale changes the same. So if I pull it out, it should be a remain 1. But you can see the rotation is this really weird number, and the position is this number, because this is where it actually is in the world as opposed to the local object that it came from. So if I put that back, Control Z until it's back where it belongs, you can see its position is, well, infinitely small compared to where it was. But that's the difference between a local position and a global position, where one is the world space and one is the difference from its parent.
And this can be very important because sometimes you'll have scripts that work off the local rotation and local orientation of a bone or an object. And if you're looking at it in global space, you might not understand why in the game it's acting up in the wrong rotation, when the problem is you need to go into local space and make sure the rotations are correct.
Exactly.
Before we get off the 3D view, we have a question. Someone would like to know, how do you switch between orthographic and perspective view in the 3D view?
Yeah, so that's going to be this little gizmo here. So this lets you switch between the different views, the left, right, from the top, and of course it loves to just put your camera somewhere that's not useful. So you may have to double click an item over here to center your camera on it, but you can do this. So you can change your view here, and orthographic is this little button here. So I am now in orthographic mode with the little 3 lines that are parallel to each other versus perspective. There we go. So this is really useful for aligning stuff. So I can switch like this, and I can hold shift and middle click to drag my scene around like this, and I can just scroll to zoom in. And you might notice that sometimes things disappear if you try to scroll in. So you can hold right click and you enter WASD mode for your camera, and you can press S on the key to bring it back, essentially, where you're moving the camera backward. If you see, have to zoom out pretty far sometimes. Oh my god, there we go. But the quick button is right here. You just click this and it switches between the two. It makes it a lot easier to line things up, especially if you're trying to be accurate, so like straight up and down or something like that. You can also, I've seen some people accidentally hide this by, you can drag this around and you can move it because it's its own little window. You can accidentally hide this button. And I don't remember the keybind to bring it back, to be honest. Not off the top of my head.
I can't help you there.
I want to say it's under window, though. I think it's one of the little panels. It's somewhere. I forget exactly where it is, but that's outside of my point for now. The other modes here are going to be, you can turn grid on and off, so you can make the grid visual. There is snapping, but even in Unity 2022, the snapping is a little wonky, so it doesn't always like to behave. So generally don't use it unless it's absolutely necessary. For world stuff, you'll have this option here. So this is more useful in worlds where you can turn on like baked light map. You can see what your light maps look like. You have wireframe. If for some reason you want that, you can look at your polygons, which isn't always useful, but it can be in larger projects where you have lots of things to worry about. Some people are just used to that. You also have shaded wireframe, which tries to put some color on it. But these are mostly just for like debug and looking at stuff. They don't really help too much. But this is how you can change those modes, and this can be changed accidentally. I've seen some people do that and wonder like, why does everything look like this? Why is it all white? You know, sorry for the flashbang, but
Sudden blizzard in Unity.
yes. You generally don't need the 2D mode. This is for if you're developing a 2D game. It puts everything into orthographic front and back like this, and you can't really move the camera at all. But it does lock your camera, like gets rid of the gizmo and you can't move it around. And people have sometimes gotten stuck in this mode and not figured out how to get out. It's this button. You click that and now you have your camera back and you can do stuff. You can mute audio from here, so you have the option to do that from here. This is if you've got an audio thing in the scene and it's constantly playing noise, you can mute audio or have it play. Usually it's off by default, so it shouldn't play noises, but you can use this to preview sounds. The layers button here is incredibly useful. The most important thing is always refresh. This makes it so that any animations you've got that are on the shader that require time or keyframing will play. So things like, let's see, do I have one? Well, actually, you can see it here with the smoke. The fact that the smoke is moving is because always refresh is on. If you have an animation on your emission where it just like kind of pulses or goes, that won't play unless animation always refresh is turned on. The rest of these are also, if you've got post-processing in the scene, you can enable or disable. You can turn on and off particle systems, so I can just disable that if it's in the way. Same thing with the skybox. You can fully remove the skybox from the view without actually turning it off. Same thing for fog if you've got that set up for worlds. Flares are almost never used, but they're a light source thing that you can have. But yes, the most important thing is to have always refresh enabled, and that is not always enabled by default. Next up, you have the camera drop down here. So this has some very useful features in that I usually turn off dynamic clipping and I set the near plane to 0.001. It's very small. You do not want it to be this. This can cause artifacting with some shaders because they will require a minimum clipping distance, and this is essentially not a number. So this can cause math issues with some things. So definitely set it to a small value, but not a number value. Far distance doesn't really matter, but you can bring it down if it's bothering you, especially in larger worlds where you've got a lot of stuff in the background and you want to just clip it out. You can bring your far distance down to like 25, and anything outside of 25 is just gone. You don't see it. So I usually leave that where it was, though. That's fine. The other thing is your camera speed. So this here, by default, you can see that I'm just barely moving and it's just zooming around all over the place. We want a small speed. I recommend usually about 0.05 is a good speed. So now if I move, especially when you're working with small things like avatars, you can get really fine movement without it zooming all over the place and getting lost. So it's a lot easier to look around and stuff like that. So of course I'm holding right click and I'm using W, A, S, and D to move around in the scene. You can also press Q to go down, E to go up. and it's very useful for navigating around your scene. You can hold middle click, and it will grab, and you can pan like this. And of course, scrolling moves in and out. So, if you're particularly good with keybinds, you can hold right click, hold control, and scroll up and down, and it will change your camera speed. So I can make it really fast, or I can make it really slow, like that. So something
And
you can do
chat
on the
does
fly.
point out there is also Maya style camera navigation where you hold down Alt and then use your mouse keys to do different camera things if you are that kind of person, which I am.
Yes. Yeah, you do have options there. So I had never used them, to be honest. So it's really just a
That's
preference
pretty much
thing.
all I use.
Mm.
Yeah, no, it depends what you learned on pretty much. I almost never use WASD. I use the Maya style stuff.
Yeah, I generally like this mode. That's just preference. So whatever works for you is your solution. So.
If you quick middle mouse click once without holding things, you can center the camera pivot where you clicked.
Yes. Yeah, that's also...
There is a free fly, Jesse. It's I think Shift Grave, so the tilde key to do a free fly camera in Blender. Also, there's it's a disabled by default. There's a VR viewport plugin for Blender I just learned recently.
Very nice. Okay. So the movement for camera stuff is there's a lot of options is what I'm getting at, but the main thing here is I definitely recommend turning down the speed. The easing acceleration, that can be kind of up to you if you want it, but if I turn these off, you'll see that there is no slowdown when I move. It just is instantly moving at that speed. Versus if I have acceleration on, it will go... Oh, actually, acceleration is... it'll approach that speed and it'll go faster. And then easing... Yeah, you can see how it adds a little bit of delay, so you can fine tap it and you can move it even a little bit less. Also, holding shift makes you go faster, just so you know. So in all forms, it seems. But I'm not going to cover every combination possible. There are a lot of mouse combinations. I can also see that there's Alt and left mouse button will do all sorts of things. So just get used to your camera movement, play around with it. You know, it's very useful to know how you can get around your scene without zooming off into the distance 25 meters. So next thing is the gizmos here. So this menu is huge, and it looks like there's a lot on here, but mostly it just lets you turn on and off the little icons for things that float in the world. So if I do that, they're no longer there. It also hides things like colliders. So if I click on this, you can see all the Fizzbone colliders and all the little markers for where things are. If I turn off gizmos, they're no longer drawn, so they're completely hidden from view. If you turn it back on, you can disable certain things. Generally, I like to turn the 3D icons down to almost nothing. I like to bring them down to about here, so that there still is an icon, but they're also not taking up 90% of the screen, which you see the difference here, how much larger that is, especially if that's hovering in front of your face or some asset that you want to see. That can be very annoying. So generally have that turned down. You can also turn off certain things, like you can turn off the selection outline, which might be useful for previews and stuff, but I don't recommend it because then you can't really tell what you have clicked. So something to note, this is where you can find that kind of thing. You can turn off specific gizmos as well, so if something is particularly getting in the way, like this camera icon, you can actually go look for it in here. Usually it will be... You can find it by its icon. It's usually in here. There we go, camera. And you can click the little button and the icon will go away. You can also hide the gizmo entirely. If it's drawing other stuff, you can turn it off with the checkbox. So that can be useful for if you've got far too many fizzbones on an object and you just need to see what you're doing. You can turn off the fizzbone component that way, or just hide the gizmos in general. I think that covers most of the 3D view. You do have options here for like what tool you're using. If I have an object selected, you can press it's the Q key for grabbing. The W key will let you grab this, so that's rotation, or sorry, position. E shifts over to rotation, so you can rotate it like that. R lets you do scaling, so you can scale the object. And in 2022, if it shows this white icon, it means that all the X, Y, and Z axes are locked together. So you can't just grab one arm. You can unlock them from over here, and then you can scale it in one direction instead of all of them. You can also press the T key, and this is mostly used for 2D stuff like UI elements. This lets you do a transform like this. But it really only works on one axis. So this kind of does that. It's kind of useful if you're trying to fit something to a very specific area without trying to get the scale perfectly right. You can just kind of switch into this mode, maybe do an orthographic view, and just kind of scale it to fit. And it will be a lot easier than trying to get the scale exactly right. And then lastly, some of you might like this. It's the everything. It does all of it. And that is, if you press Y, it takes you to this one, which just has, it's got your scale box in the middle. It's got your transform that locks to 2 axes here. And you can grab the arrow for one specific axis. Then you have your rotation circles all around it, as well as this white one, which does it based on the camera view. So whatever my camera is looking at, it's trying to rotate it along that. And then finally, the scale axes are out here. So
also worth mentioning, holding Shift and Control while doing those transforms alters them.
yes.
You can either slow it down with Shift or one snaps, one slows them down. I forget which is which.
Yeah, one control snaps, so it'll try to snap it to an increment of whatever you have. Shift will try to do. Let's see, hang on. It doesn't really work in this mode. Let me try this mode. So if I hold Shift, it should do less. Although it's kind of hard in the 3D view. It usually is better if you're doing this. So if I hold Shift and then do this, it does by a lot instead of by a little.
Yeah.
So okay, I think that covers most of the 3D view. Let's move on to the next one. The console. So I don't have any errors in this project, but I can make one. We're just gonna go here and we're just gonna
love doing things wrong on purpose.
Yeah, we're just gonna make a C# script, and we're just gonna, I don't care what it's called, but I'm gonna put some bad code in this script.
Just the worst.
Yes. Oh, and now my project is gonna recompile, and it's gonna have all sorts of problems, and my things don't work anymore. So we're gonna go to console, and we can see if I close
look at all these errors.
Now, these are warnings. These are just random messages that are given to me. Actually, it looks like it didn't make an error. That's interesting.
Huh.
Hang on. Maybe I need to put this in another spot.
I was going to say, did you put it on a component at all?
You know what? I didn't. Let's delete that. Let's try this again, shall we?
Might be why.
Let's just make... I guess I do just need... Nah, we'll make a script. This is on the fly, so fun. Alright, let's try that. That should cause it to fail. So, there we go, I got a red. So, in your console, you have 3 types of messages. You have just messages, which are usually just spammed by whatever plugins or anything you have. These can be completely ignored. You don't have to worry about them. In fact, I usually turn them off by clicking that button so that it's unhighlighted. You can get warnings, which sometimes are worth looking at, but most of the time can be ignored, as well as errors. And the errors are the most important thing. Now, the thing about errors is that they're listed bottom to top in order of when they happened. So the topmost error is the first error that the compilation encountered, and it will cascade down and create other errors because one thing didn't compile, several other things couldn't compile. And so usually the last error you see is the most meaningless error that you could look at. You need to look at the first error in the list. So if I had 4 or 5 of them listed here, I'd want to look at the first one in the list. That's the one that's causing all the rest to happen. So if we can solve this one, then usually the rest will fix themselves because it's usually this first one that's causing the problem. Now, to actually figure out what that problem is, you do have to read what the error message says. And sometimes that means just figuring out, like, it tells you what the path is to the object, usually, what type of error it is, and any description that can be given from what was thrown. So it tells me here that in this file, assets new behavior script.cs, on line 4, and in character 35, it tells me exactly where the problem is. It says it couldn't find a reference or something. So let me just pull that over here, and we can look at it. So this is the file, and all I did was I deleted this. And it was even telling me that on line 4, like, hey, I don't know what this object is because this object comes from here. So it told me, hey, problem with your script. Here's your problem. Here's the line. Here's the error number. So line 4, let me redo that. Boop. It told me line 4 and the character at which it started, which was over here. So make sure you read your errors because it will tell you what the problem is. You just have to actually look at it. And again,
very often you'll find.
Go ahead.
Very often you'll find when you look at the top, it's actually just a missing dependency of something you've added. A package you imported needs another package first, and the error message will pretty much tell you that if you read it.
And that's specific to like scripting, but like oftentimes what happens is I see people import 2 versions of like Poyomi, and Poyomi does not like having multiple versions of itself in the same project. They will collide, they will clash, and they will cause errors. So you must remove all files related to Poyomi before installing a new version of Poyomi. And one of the things it does is it will prevent you from installing another version if it sees this folder. If that folder is there, it will tell you, hey, there's already a Poyomi installed. Get rid of it first. Because that was a common problem when Poyomi was first starting out. People would just import the latest version on top of their old one and cause all sorts of problems. But that's a common one. So make sure you're looking at your error and read what it says. It will tell you exactly where the problem is. And it's usually pretty verbose about it. So Unity is actually pretty good about that, getting you in the right spot to fix your problem. A lot of compilers don't care.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So that's something that I just want to make sure that people are really good on, because I get that a lot where people are like, oh, there's a problem with my project and I have no idea what's wrong. It's like, well, look at your console. Where's my console? Here's your console. Make sure you have errors shown. Notice I can turn them off, right? But if it's a persistent error and you try to clear this, it doesn't go away. That means that your project cannot continue without fixing this problem. Now, if you can clear this and it does go away, then it's no longer an issue and you can probably ignore it. So just something worth noting.
And if you seek help from someone else, again, scroll to the top, send them a screenshot of the first error.
Mm-hmm. And make sure you actually click on it too, because there's sometimes more text that will show up down here that gives even more details about what could have gone wrong. Like it provides a stack trace usually. It shows like where it was when it reached the error. Okay, was there any questions on that before we move on to another topic?
There's someone typing right now.
Okay. Before we move on, I'm going to remove that file so that it doesn't create issues. And look, it's gone now.
Yay. Which error comes first? The top of the... So as we were saying, the bottommost error, it goes... Yes, the top is the one that most likely is causing all of the ones below it, which Unity is not always helpful. It will automatically scroll to the bottom and show you the least important one first. So you need to manually scroll back up to check your errors.
And sometimes it can be hundreds of them. If something particularly causes, like, if something causes your shaders to stop functioning, you will get hundreds of errors because all the rest of the shaders can't compile. So you want to scroll all the way to the top and find the first one.
Also, clicking clear is good because sometimes if it's a runtime error, you'll get literally thousands of them because they'll be happening every frame. But when you click clear, those will all disappear and the persistent error will remain.
Yes, and sometimes it's very nice to just have an empty console. It's a
that too. Clean console, clean mind.
Yes. And you can see there's background tasks that run too, and they'll print errors in here. So you'll end up with just random messages that could be thousands of them, and they're all useless. Okay, let's see. I wanted to cover some things on the inspector itself. So let's select an object here. So the inspector here, of course, lets you edit any object in the scene. Now, something that a lot of people don't get from the start is that the transform is a component. So, and each object can have any number of components which describe how the object functions in the scene. Everything gets a transform. It sometimes is named differently if you're working with UI elements, but it's the same idea. It has a position, a rotation, and a scale. And that is true for literally everything. Unity uses this component to determine if it's the child of something else, to determine its scale relative to the scene, relative to its parent, all sorts of other information, but it is also a component, which means you can copy it. You can copy the whole component. You can paste it into another object, and of course, since every object gets a free transform component, it'll just paste into that component, so you can move it around. You can also add components from the bottom here, and most of the things that you do in VRChat for your avatar or your world rely on components, or components that are on an object somewhere. The most common ones are colliders, so things like you have box colliders, you've got sphere colliders, which can do all sorts of stuff. Very common ones are box colliders. These just throw up a little box around whatever object you put it on, and if you happen to put it on a mesh, it will use the bounds of the mesh to make the size of the box. Now, if I remove this, remove component, and let's say if I did it on, let me create an empty object. I'm just gonna right click, create empty. And I have this random game object here with, there's nothing on it. It's just an empty point in space. If I add a box collider to this, it gets the default values of just a 1 meter cube. But if I add it to a mesh, it'll try to size to the bounds of the mesh. So you saw how when I added it to this, it matched the size of this little white grid. So box colliders can be useful that way. The components themselves, they're all listed here. So when you're working with VRChat, VRC will help filter a lot of the stuff that works specifically for VRChat. So things like fizzbones, your colliders for those, your actual descriptor, so the avatar descriptor, which is this part, show up under that list, and those are all components. They're usually just a script or something that helps configure the object for Unity or for whatever else you're trying to do.
Before we get too far away from transforms, we have a question.
Yes.
Why sometimes when you enter value into the transforms, it automatically snaps to 100th up or down?
That is actually a fundamental error in floating point precision, which is a whole topic unto itself. But
with that.
Unity uses floating points for pretty much everything. For position, rotation, and scale, they're all actually floating points. They're not an integer, which means that it has to keep track of all the numbers past the decimal. And there is a problem where in most computer systems, if you add certain floating point numbers together, you get this really, really, really long number, and it sets it to its approximation of the next closest number. And that's what you're seeing when you get those random, like, little bits of info. Even though it looks like it's a small increment, it's just in between what a floating point number can represent, and it will snap to the next one.
If you've ever seen Panakoic's Parallel Worlds video, that's pretty much what's going on here. The floating point has a limited amount of precision.
Yeah, so...
this is exactly the point. The E is scientific notation.
Mm-hmm.
There's an enormous number of digits after the point, and there's not enough precision to accurately represent the real number in a computer's.
What is it? Space. I think the quickest way to trigger it is, I think, if you add 0.4 to 0.3, or wasn't it? Which, by the way, you can do math in these. So if I put in a plus symbol and type in 0.1 and then hit enter, it'll do the math for me, and I'll get 0.4.
You can do that in Blender too. A lot of people don't know that.
Yes, most of these you can do all sorts of complex things. I can type in a whole fucking formula in here and it will work.
Do algebra.
Times 4 plus 6. Boof. Now it's over there. So.
Another orca has entered the
chat. But yes, that random number that you sometimes see is because floating point numbers can only represent so many infinitesimal decimal points. and sometimes it's right in between where it can represent, so it has to snap to this really weird number, and that's what you'll see for a while. Usually it's fine, and if you add like a small amount to it, it fixes itself, or you can just leave it be, because the computer understands what the representation of that number actually is, even though it doesn't look good. Okay, good question though. That's something that has been plaguing computer scientists for a very long time. So, the next thing I wanted to cover was options for components and presets. So, if you look on every single one of these component headers, there is a little checkbox. You can turn them on and off, easy peasy. You can animate this as well, so that's something worth noting for animations and stuff. You can turn off the component instead of the whole object. On the side here, though, we have this option called Reset, as well as a whole bunch of other stuff. So, in this particular case, this is a prefab, and I have made changes to this object. And as a result, I can actually apply those changes to the prefab so that it, or revert them rather, so that it sets them back to normal. But the more important thing is that I can copy all the settings from this component. So if I copy this, I can then add a new one. I can go just paste. Where is it? Oh, I'm in the material. Whoops. Paste. As component values, or I can make a new component on another object and paste those values in. So that's useful for copying over things like fizzbones or colliders or stuff like that. But yeah, this menu here can be useful for all sorts of things. So, get pretty familiar with it. The next one is presets. These presets are useful in that you can store all the settings of this component into a file. So you can have it written to disk, and then when you want to use it again, you can just click this little preset button and it'll show up in this list. So let's say that these fizzbones here, right? So the tail fizzbones. So all this data in the script, like I don't want to have to do this every time I want to set up this avatar or work with a new version of the model. Or say I want to move these tails to another model and they have the exact same layout, and I want to put this in another project. Well, I can click this little preset button and we can create new preset. It'll ask us where to put it in the assets folder. I'm just going to leave it in the main folder, and it gives us a default name. I'm going to call this tails fizzbone, and we'll just save it. And you'll see it wrote a file here. And if I click on this, you can actually see it'll show me what script it goes to, as well as all the settings that are in this preset. So now, if I want to say change these values to, oh no, they're all messed up because I was experimenting and I wanted to try some fun things, and now all my settings are wrong and I don't remember what they were. Well, I can just go to this and poof, they're all back to where they should be because it stored that entire component as its own little file. You can take this file and set it into another project. You can export it, you can hand it off to a friend, be like, here's some settings for your hair. I configured something cool for you, or this object needs an updated fizzbone, or this, that, or the other thing. You have the option to send these settings to somebody else because it's all self-contained within this file. So that is incredibly useful and something I don't see people using enough, where they can just include different fizzbone presets or stuff like that for something. Let's see. That's a feature that I feel like not enough people talk about. Oh yeah, so always brings a good point when it comes to like bone rotations and stuff in your armature. You may see stuff like this where they just look wrong. All these little end up numbers here. This is again that floating point error. So these numbers represent the same thing as what they're really close to. They just don't display right. They just don't look good. But you definitely don't want to be messing with these for the most part if they're coming straight from a model from Blender or something. You want to change that in Blender rather than doing that here.
The import process of bones from Blender to anything else is already very fragile.
Very much,
Not
yes.
to be messed with manually, yes.
Okay. Let's move on to next topic. So, unless somebody has anything to say, I see a few people typing. Next topic is going to be some animation stuff. So I'm going to briefly cover animations in Animator windows. And I realize that my windows are gone because I reset.
We do have a few viewers in Twitch. Thank you for the raid earlier, Boris.
Oh, hello.
We are watching the chat there too. If anyone has comments in that chat, this is mostly going on in the VRCS Discord, though.
Yes. From our chat, somebody mentions turn off leaf bones from exporting from Blender. Sometimes you want to do that. Most of the time, yes. Sometimes you don't want to do that. There are very few cases where that is necessary. So most of the time, yes, you should turn off leaf bones. Leaf bones are an empty bone at the end of the last bone in the chain. So for instance, if I go to the fingers here, a leaf bone would be just some empty bone floating off the end here that does nothing. The only reason it's there is because it gives that last bone in the chain a length value. Where if it wasn't there, this last bone wouldn't have a length, and fizz bones would end pretty much right where it starts because it doesn't know how long it should be. But leaf bones are used specifically for that. You don't always need them. Sometimes you can just tell the fizz bone component, like, hey, go this much extra longer past the last bone you see, and you don't need a leaf bone.
My personal approach is if I need a leaf bone, it's usually for specifically a fizz bone. I will manually make the leaf bone and export without leaf bones.
Yes.
Because as Jesse points out, if you leave that export option on and you go back and forth, you can quickly end up with a chain of leaf bones being added over and over and over and make a huge mess.
Yes, so it's one of those options where if you know what you're doing, you can turn it on. If you don't, leave it off. It's best to leave it off.
The reason it exists, Blender is very special. It's the only 3D program I know of that bones have a head and a tail. Every other program uses only joints. But speaking of importing from Blender, Volt brings up something I wanted to bring up. Unity can import blend files. Unity themselves says never do this. It's something they added at one point, and they highly, highly, highly discourage you use that feature. It's only legacy now. It bloats your files, and Blender commonly changes their file format between versions, completely breaking your project.
Yes.
You go from, say, 4.3 to 4.4, and you rely on Blender imports. So do not use that feature.
The reason Unity added it in the first place is that it silently, under the hood, converts the whole project to an FBX. It just takes whatever is in the project and turns it into an FBX. So you generally don't want that if you've got other stuff in your project. But there is a way that you can have your Blender file in your project folder without Unity trying to load it. If you go to your folders here, show and explorer, and I go to my assets folder, I can make a new folder, and I can add a tilde to it. So I'm going to call this hidden. I'm going to put the tilde symbol at the end, and anything that's in that folder does not get imported into Unity. So you can go ahead and store your Blender project files into this folder, and you don't have to, every time you save or autosave, wait for Unity to reload that file. So this is a useful way to hide files within your project that you don't want Unity to look at. So that's something that's a little thing you could do to trick Unity. It's not actually a trick, it's just a core feature, but it's very useful if you want to keep your project's files together. So okay.
Raz brings up an interesting point. Raz would like a little tutorial about the perfect export settings. Problem is that depends on your Unity project. It's not the same all the time.
Yes, for the most part, there are certain settings that are very useful. We'll cover that on the Blender one because there are certain situations where you want different settings. So for the most part, though, FBX all and turn off leaf bones. So those should be the two most important things you could worry about. The rest, though, it is somewhat dependent on whether or not you're replacing a model or just starting from scratch with a brand new one. So
this is the very first night we're doing this.
Okay, so I'm going to move on to some animation and controllers and stuff. So I'm going to talk about recording and making animations. So I'm only going to cover this briefly because this is one of those things where, like, you can delve into this pretty deeply and you can do some pretty crazy stuff, but I'm not going to worry about that too much. So first things first, when you're working with an avatar, by default, once you have the animation rig set up, once you've got the humanoid armature set up, it automatically adds this animator component to your avatar. It will not fill in the controller. So normally this is set to nothing. What you can do is you can take whatever controller you're going to put on your avatar. So I usually work with the FX controller. And let me go to the browser here. If you have your project browser selected and you click on a file reference, it will highlight that file for you. So now I can bring that controller and drop it in here. And this animator connects to the animation window and the animator tab. So if I have this object selected and it has an FX controller or a controller specified, all the animations that are in this controller will show up in this dropdown. They will also show all the layers available to it in here. So now I can edit all of the properties of that FX controller. Now if you need to edit one specifically, you can just select it in your files and you can double click on it. So if I double click on it, you can see the small name down here changes, showing me that I'm editing a different controller right there. So I'm going to stay with the one that comes with this avatar. And down here in the animation tab, once you have this window selected, any objects underneath it can be animated now. So if I click on this drop down, let's go to the eyes. Let's go to the idle animation. And what I can do is I can click record. And when we're in this mode, your character will jump into what's known as bicycle pose. This is kind of an unofficial name, but everybody calls it bicycle pose. But it means that I can now edit stuff. So if I change any properties on any objects in here, it will add a keyframe for me, so I can change, say, the position. And you'll see it stores that information here. It says that I changed the position by this much. I can also do things like change the blend shape. So let's do that. And it will store, you'll see that it turns red. That means that it has changed. So it also stores that information. Now, this is most useful for editing blend shapes and properties of, say, a material. So if you have a material that has an animated property, you can change its value by just moving the slider and it will keep track of it. This only works if you have the model selected, so in this case the body mesh, and then I scroll down to where the materials are listed. You can edit these values and it will record here. If you try to leave record mode here, if you try to just click on the material itself, so let me open the material so that it's its own inspector, it has no reference to which mesh this is coming from. So if you try to record, nothing happens. So if I click this drag button, it doesn't know what mesh to reference or how to store that file. But if I select the body mesh and scroll down to where these body materials are listed, and then change that same option, now you see it has a reference body, and it knows what component to change as well as what value to change. So if you ever run into this problem where you're trying to record animations for your materials, it's because you don't have the body mesh selected or the mesh that it is tied to selected. So that's an important distinction to make when you're making your recordings. I'm going to go ahead and delete these because I don't want those actually in there. And then if I leave preview mode, you'll see he goes back to his bicycle pose and he's back to normal. Now, you might notice that this guy over here decided, oh, I'm going to jump into bicycle pose too. This is a bug. So Unity has this fun bug where sometimes when you go to edit, it puts your character into bicycle pose and it doesn't come back out.
Like you planned this.
Uh-huh. So what you can do is, if you select this other object, there's a third-party tool called Pumpkin's Avatar Tools, which I don't have installed at the moment. I did not install. But there's an option there that lets you reset the pose to a T-pose. The other way to do this is to go to your option here, and you can see this little overrides menu underneath the prefab, and it lists everything that's changed on this object since it was dragged into scene. What I'm going to do is just tell it to reset these transforms. So these are all the arms. There's the legs, there's the spine, the eyes, the shoulders, the arms. I'm just going to click all these. I'm holding shift, by the way, to select more than one. And it just goes all those, and hold control for these. And I'm going to revert selected. So these are the transform components of each of those objects. I'm just going to set them back to where they should be. And ta-da, we're back in T-pose. Because bicycle pose does not write its files. It doesn't write to the files. It doesn't store the rotation. It sets it manually, which means that you can revert it. So if you get stuck in bicycle pose, that's a solution. The other one is to use Pumpkin's avatar tools and do a T-pose force. But we'll cover that later when we do avatar stuff. Now, a way to reliably cause this is often to have a object in here that also has an animator on it. And Unity doesn't really like it when you have two animators parented to each other. So this one has an animator. And if I add another object down here with another animator and then try to animate that, then you might get stuck in bicycle pose. And that could be very annoying if you're working with that. In cases like that, I recommend either putting your controller up in this top level object or bring it outside of the hierarchy and work on it there. It's better to just put your controller in here and then edit it that way, rather than try to do all the stuff of shuffling stuff around. So you end up with better workflow that way, because it's kind of designed so that there should only be one top level animator. There shouldn't be stuff underneath it. At least that's the way they expect you to use it. For now, that's all I'm going to cover on animation stuff, just because that's a topic that can go on. I could go on forever about that kind of thing. There's a lot of stuff you can do. There's a lot of things to delve into. But for the most part, that's a good overview, I think. We are kind of getting a little bit long, so I want to start moving on to the next thing. Did anybody have any questions on that one that they'd like? Any burning questions? I see someone typing, so give them a second.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay. All right.
No.
So moving on. So the asset browser. So that is this project browser down here. So again, this is where all your files are. A key distinction to make here is that the assets folder and the packages folder are all considered part of your project, but you shouldn't change the files in the packages folder. The exception is that you should not be moving stuff in here. So like you shouldn't move stuff around, you shouldn't rename things, you should not be editing these files. These are kind of supposed to be special in the case that you reference them, but you don't touch them. So you're allowed to, of course, you've got VRC Fury in here, we have the SDK files, but the idea is that you don't edit these files. So that's where they go into the packages folder. Anything in the assets folder, fair game. You can do whatever you want to it. You can move it around, you can put it in different folders, you can rename them as much as you like. Unity so much doesn't care what the file name is or where it is in the folders. Everything gets hashed into like I don't know what's the hash is, but it gets a reference essentially. So once this file is used somewhere, so this material uses this texture right next to it, right? But if I move this texture to another folder, let's just move it out to the main assets folder, and I go edit this material, you'll see, oh, it knows exactly where it is. Not because it kept track of like its actual path, but because it knows that this asset has a specific ID. And I can go to the material that was, and it says, this is the ID that I care about that's in this space. So this is what a file reference is. And a file reference just says, I have this file in this space. And I can move this anywhere I want. So I'm going to put this back where it belongs. And you'll see that it updates immediately, because Unity keeps track of that. Now, the difference between an object reference and a file reference is what's important here. As in, all the stuff up here is mostly object references. So if I go into here and I have this object called the hips bone. So this is an object reference to something in the scene, and that is an object. This is a file reference. This is a material stored on disk over here. So if I change this material, anything that references this material gets updated. And I don't have to go back here and update this manually. So that also means that if I change the materials from down here, this editor here is just an embedded single editor. But any changes I make here get written to the file. So that means that anything else that references this material gets automatically updated. So let me show you what that means. So I have two meshes here, right? I have this avatar and the one next to it. And they both use a material called body. Poof. but they're two separate body materials. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over here and drop this one in here. So now this has a file reference to that body material. So both of these have the same reference, right? So what I can do now is go to this material, and I'm just going to make it an obviously different color, and you'll see it updated both of them at the same time, because that is a file reference, and this is written to file. Now if I made this an object reference, I can edit anything I want about that object, and it won't change on the other. Now, if I want to make this, I'm just going to bring this back actually, so undo all that. And I'm just hitting Control Z until they're back.
Brings up something interesting that
Yes.
I have not experienced and know. If you edit something in Windows Explorer, move a location, it will not automatically track the reference, and they break things.
It very well can. So
yeah.
The reason for that is if I go to the Explorer file for this, you'll notice that next to every one of these, so this is the material file, there's this .meta file. This .meta file is not really something you can, you're not supposed to edit, but you can. It's actually just raw text. Bring it up here. And basically just says some useful stuff. So here's the hash. This is what this file is referenced as in all of Unity. So whenever you specify this file in a material, let's go here. Let's bring this into my editor. Because material files, fun fact, are also just a text file. Ooh, lots of stuff. But what I can do is, since I know that this material references, where's the texture? Hang on. Oh, you know what? Let's do a different one. Let me grab that that little Sakura material here. This one, right? So I can right-click, show and explore, and now I have the PNG and the material that references. So I'm just going to grab this material and the meta file for that PNG, because this is the ID of that PNG. If I copy this and go to this file, and if I'm going to find and paste, look, here's where that file is used. So it says the emission map is equal to this GUID, which is how we tell what these things are. So if you could do this in Windows and move this file around, if I move this file, I'm just going to put this in the main folder. It doesn't know what this file is. It's going to have to rehash it. So it has to re-import that file. And now it's got a different ID. So if I bring this open here, and we compare the two, so here's the original. Oh wait, no, that's the material. This one. To this one. Notice how the number changed. Totally different number. So it lost the reference because it had to regenerate a new reference for this file that it knows nothing about. This is how Unity tracks everything. That's why there's a .meta file for every file and folder, because it has to. That's how it tracks what things are. So if I move this file back into that folder, it was here. You'll notice that the meta file is gone because Unity already did the cleanup. I'm just going to save this one because that's the original, right? Boop. And I manually recreated that meta file. You'll notice it comes back, but my file references are fixed. It still points to it. And you'll see that the other one out here is pretty much gone. So, but that's because Unity doesn't care what the path is. So if you do things in Windows where you're moving stuff around, move the meta file too. So if I move both of these now, you'll see it'll be just fine. Boop, we'll go back. Didn't have to re-import anything, but it still found the file. So just make sure that if you're going to move stuff around in Windows, you keep the meta files along with them. They have to be in the same folder. They have to be right next to each other. If they're not, then you messed it up, and Unity will have to re-import, and it'll get a different ID. And this is for safety. This is so that you can have two of the same object, and it will automatically generate new IDs for each one, so that you don't end up with conflicts. Let's put that back where it belongs. Oof. And you'll see Unity doesn't really have to do any import step for that. It just knows. And look, it's back where it belongs. So the preview may have broken, but we can actually force that to refresh. I believe it is just re-import. Don't re-import all. Don't click this button. This does your whole project. Just click re-import.
Go back to sandwich. You click that.
Yes. Usually that's enough to fix it. I might have to do this one. Re-import. Or just do a refresh. Nah, it's gonna be mean. Whatever. You get the idea.
Yeah. Well,
Okay. So I think that covers the difference between assets and packages. So you don't want to be editing stuff in packages. It should always be in your assets folder. Um, in terms of staying organized, it's really just make folders. Don't be afraid to make extra folders. Like store your stuff into all sorts of categories. So like Poyomi here has a really nice organization where they've got the prefabs, they've got their presets stored in here. These are materials that have all sorts of settings for you. The scripts, the shaders, the textures, they're all organized into nice folders that make them easier to find. Um, so don't be afraid to make folders. The more you make, the better. I think that covers most of the. Oh, search functions. That's right. I wanted to mention the search functions. So one thing that's really useful. Say you're editing a material, instead of clicking this little tiny circle dot to browse every file in your project known to man,
yeah.
we can instead search for what we want. So let's say I want the Sakura texture. I can select my whole folder. You can type in what you want. And let's say I don't want all of these results. I just want the textures. There we go. You can actually add it to your thing, the type, and then the thing, and there we go. I have exactly one result. There's that. You can also have it search through the packages, or all, which is just everything. Usually you don't want to search through packages unless you're looking for something like the SDK stuff, but it makes it a lot easier to find things. You can also just type in nothing and search by a type. Let's do by material. Nope, not mesh. Material. And it'll find every material in your project, or in the assets folder, or in the specific folder that you have selected. I go material, and then this one. It shows me all the materials in that folder that I've got selected, and its subfolders. So if I select the Poyomi shaders folder, you'll see it's type material under the Poyomi shaders folder, so it lists everything in there. Makes it a lot easier to find stuff. And if you have more than one project tab, you can lock this tab. Let me just add another project tab real quick. So add tab, project. I'm gonna put this up here. So now that this one's locked, I can click other stuff in my project. I can go edit stuff. I can go into hierarchy, and it's really nice to be able to have like a folder that is just like all the stuff that you use the most as a search, and it's just stored down here and kept for you. So it's sometimes useful to have a second project tab open with all that stuff in there. Okay. I believe I've covered most of the topics I'd like to cover. I did mention one thing I'd like to talk about is the file references versus object references, which I touched on. Binksy, how do you think I did on that so far? Should I cover more?
I think you might overload people if you covered more, unless you have something really,
Okay.
really urgent to mention about that.
All right. I think that's a pretty good overview of most of this stuff. So at this point, I'd love to go into Q&A mode, where if anybody has any questions or anything they'd like to ask about, even if it's like, something specific, that's fine. I'll cover what I can. But I'd say we'll do however long it takes to just cover whatever questions. So if anybody has anything, now is the time. And I can just ramble on about whatever.
Yes. Not a question, but a comment about you can also click on the file and remove the text. When this is speaking about searching, click on the file, remove the text for Unity to take you directly to the file. I'm not entirely sure what that's referring to. Yeah, why don't we
Go ahead, yeah.
on stage.
Welcome, Wave, to the stage.
You're welcome.
Hi everyone.
Aloha.
It's been a while since I popped in here. Oh my. Okay. So
Yeah.
if you might, Major, can you please return to your assets like main
Yes.
folder? Thank you. Now type in Sakura again for me.
Yep.
So this is just going off of the example we demonstrated before for searching for a specific file by searching its name. Now let's say instead of sorting, you've already found the item you want. So click on the texture. Now, instead of us searching for it, let's say we were searching it for a different purpose. We wanted to find its original file location. If you then go up to the search bar and remove the text by hitting the X, it will take you directly to the folder.
Oh, yes, yeah, it clears out the search. I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah,
You're no longer looking at the search results, you're looking at the asset folder it resides in.
Yeah, because it updates to the reference, and the reference shows you what section of the project it's in. So that happens with anything that's a file reference. So if you click on it in the editor, it will try to bring it highlighted to your project browser, whichever one you've got. If you have it locked, it won't do that. So if I go to, say, this body material, you'll see that it tried, but it highlighted the little lock saying, oh, I can't do it. But if I go to this project browser, it did it, because that one's not locked. So the same happens when you're in a search. So if I search for Sakura, and looking at assets, there we go, and I select it, it actually tries to highlight it, but we're technically in a search, so this is like a sub-window inside. So the second you clear out the search, it switches back to actual project browser mode, which brings you back to exactly where the file was. So that's why that works the way it is. So it makes it very useful to find like what folder was something in. That's a good thing to bring up. So specifically things like if I want to find the fluff, so like they're all in this subfolder here, and couldn't remember where it was, but I remember it was fluff something, right? Here we go, fluff base, and then I can close this out, and now, ta-da! I'm in the folder where it belongs in the file. You can also you get all sorts of useful context menus items here. The most useful I find is Show and Explorer. This brings you to the file where it is in the project, so you can easily bring it into, say, another editor or something like that. And you saw me use that earlier.
Yeah, or nowhere to overwrite it if you're doing that.
Exactly.
I recommend only using this specifically for certain situations. For instance, I specifically use it for something that will, I believe, be taught at a later point. And I don't want to overload, obviously, everyone here. A lot has been covered since I joined.
I've been moving through kind of fast because we're recording.
You also joined mid-session.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, yeah. I apologize. I run another thing. I'm not going to get into that. Keeps me very busy. But what I wanted to say is I use this for a function of finding specific FBX files for editing. Because in Blender, you are required to give a location of the file. And if you have a lot of folders inside of your Unity project, it can be very tedious to go through them all to find your FBX. So in this case, you are able to find it, right-click, Show in Explorer, and grab the exact address path for the file for Blender.
You can also copy path, by the way. That's also an option.
That is a feature I did notice recently, and I felt very stupid.
Yeah, so an Explorer is useful if you want to get into the folder, but copy path will actually give you the whole path, so I can just poof there. Now, the downside to this is it's local, so you kind of already have to be in the folder. But yeah, Show an Explorer will give you the absolute project path, so much easier to find. Okay, let's not save that. I don't want to save any of these, so nope. Okay, thank you very much for...
has a question that they're typing up, by the way, for you. So
oh, yes. Thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you. Good addition.
Okay, did anybody else have any questions? Anything they'd like answered?
Looked like Razra was typing something up. Okay. So Razra was asking about the difference between FBX all, unit scale, all local. We might want to do that. I don't know. Do we want to get into that now, or when we get to the Blender stuff?
Unless we have any other Unity-related questions, I can end the stream here, and then I can cover that for you right here in the stream. So I'd say at this point we can go ahead and call this done for now. I'd say it was pretty successful for first time. Thanks for letting me talk at you. And hopefully this is useful for some of you, and you saw some some good useful features in there, as well as a little bit more of an understanding of what you're working with when it comes to Unity non-sensory. So
Yeah, thank you for letting me come along for the ride. This was fun.
I hope to do more of these. So I do plan on covering Blender and Substance Painter at least, and then I'd like to go into some more topics like using VRC Fury, setting up an avatar, all sorts of other fun stuff for like worlds and light baking and all that good stuff. So they'll probably be shorter topics, but I'd like to cover them at least. So I hope to see you all again. For now, I'm going to wrap up and call this a finish. Let me do my special little whoop, and then and then we'll just go ahead and we'll have that fade in. Wow. There we go. But welcome, Fanciest Facts. All right. Good night, everybody, and thank you very much for coming. And stick around if you want to cover some more off-topic stuff, and we can discuss and go over that. For now, the boy is saying goodbye. All right.